Good morning, California Grain and Feed. Jesse Moran here with Screw Conveyor Corporation. Today's presentation is going to be a little bit more on a social media type platform. With all the new technology going around and the new platforms, we're going to give it a try. So let's give it a go. Before we start here today, I do want to make an announcement. Screw Conveyor Corporation recently celebrated their 90th year anniversary. 90 years is a whole lot of time to be in the industry, and they've been serving many industries at that. So a big shout out to Screw Conveyor Corporation for their 90th year anniversary. Let's get this thing going, guys. So in today's presentation, what I'm going to be discussing is how to properly size a screw conveyor, how to ask for replacement parts and identify those parts, and how to properly install a screw conveyor. So with this, let's get going, guys. So what we are looking at here is a screw conveyor in an expanded form. And what I want to show you guys is, this is a cover, and right here, this is a hanger, this is a shroud. Now typically shrouds are used for inclines or choke fed applications, but we'll get to that later. We do have a screw coupled together with the coupling shaft, coupling bolts, and then the next screw. We have our trough, we have our trough end plate, shaft, bearing, seals, and we have a discharge spout at this point. We also have a support foot and flanges with the flange hardware. So wanted to show you guys what a screw conveyor is before we get to the next episode. Okay, so what we have here is a screw conveyor that's already pre-assembled. And what I'm gonna show you next is how I would measure a screw conveyor out in the field. Now, we do know that there's complications out in the field. You might have some covers on, you may have to climb some ladders or platforms or whatever the case may be. But what I'm gonna show you is how I would identify a screw conveyor and size it. Now I'm gonna give you a helpful hint here. Anytime you want to measure a screw conveyor, you want to do it at a rigid point. Do it at a hanger area or a trough end plate area. Now, I know there's complications out in the field, like I mentioned, but you need to have access to a point where it's rigid enough to measure the ID of the conveyor. If you measure it out in the middle, it varies. It opens up a little bit, so it's not going to give you an accurate dimension. But if we measure the inside of this angle where it's at the trough end, let's take a look here. So we have 21 inches. Now, 21 inches is telling me it's a 20-inch screw. How do I know that? So what I want to show you is page 50 in our SEC engineering catalog. I want to show you that A dimension. Now, if you refer over to our 20-inch and go to column A, you'll see that 21 inches that we just measured. Now, a screw needs half-inch clearance around this trough here. So what you want to do is take off 1 inch off of this dimension A. Will give you the actual screw size. SEMA standard size for a screw. So 20-inch is your screw size. So where can you find this catalog? You can either go to screwconveyor.com and download it, or use this QR code that I just attached. Okay, so now that we identified the sizing of the conveyor based on the ID of the trough, let's identify the trough and what type of trough this is. So what we're looking at here is an angle type trough. And how do we know that? This guy right here. So there's an angle actually welded to the trough itself, and therefore making it an angle type trough. Now, what do we need to know as far as replacement parts and what information does screw conveyor need in order for you to get your replacement is, one, identify, you already know it's an angle type trough. You know it's a 20-inch by the measurement that we took on the ID of the trough. Next thing we need to know is the thickness of the actual trough itself. Now, in order to get the thickness of the trough, it gets a little bit tricky. You definitely have to take the cover off in order to access the inside. You can either take the trough end plate off, or you can take the cover off. I would suggest to take the cover off. And if you notice in this little slot here, you have an angle and you have the trough material. In this slot, you can actually see the thickness of the trough. That's where you can get your thickness. So now that we know the style of trough that we have, which is an angle type trough, we know the thickness of the material and also the size of the trough. Well, the next thing we need to know is actually the length of the trough. So what you want to do is you want to get flange to flange and get that dimension. So now what I want to show you here is there's not just angle type troughs, there's many types of troughs. Angle type, obviously the one we just looked at, and then we have our double flange trough, which is the most common size. Now if you notice here, you will see where the actual trough is formed as a double flange, so basically a double break. We do have a single flange trough take breaks here and ends here. Now let me show you the different types of troughs. This is the angle type trough that we just went through. This is also the double flange trough that I just explained with the double flanges. Here's a snippet of that double flange trough. Where I want to show you is that double area right here. So that double form goes up, over, and down. That's the double flange. This is our flare type trough, which is typically used under a hopper area or to move big masses of material. And we also have our tubular type troughs, which are used for incline type situations or other special situations that may need. Now, those are the most common type of troughs that I just mentioned, but if you want to get to the full list of troughs that we have, you want to head over to screwconveyor.com, go to Download Center, and find our catalog. You can also swing by our tabletop exhibit and take a copy for yourself. Hopefully that wasn't too much for you guys to take in. Phase 1 was a little long. We measured some troughs. Now we're off to phase 2, which is measuring some screws and how to determine size on that. Plus we have phase 3 coming in and assembling some conveyors. So we'll see you in a bit. Okay guys, so we're in our screw conveyor department, and what we're going to do today is we're going to measure the OD of the pipe. We're going to measure from the OD of the pipe to the outside of the flight, and we're going to add these two dimensions to determine the diameter of the screw. We're going to measure the inside of this bushing, and we're going to measure the entire length of the screw. So one of the key pieces of information that we need is the thickness of the flight. Now, obviously, you're going to get information off the screw because you need to replace it. It's wore out. But what you want to do is you want to get to a point in the screw where you know it's not as wore out, so you can get the flight thickness and therefore get your replacement correctly. So when it comes to a right hand or a left hand screw, you know, there's many different ways of figuring that out. Everybody has their own little method, you know, the wrap around the flight, whether it goes to your right or whether it goes to your left. If you want to get your index finger and take it across the top of the flight, and wherever it navigates, whether to the right or to the left, determines the right hand or the left hand. Now, all those points are correct, but there's always the safest method to do it, right? Now, the other piece of information that we need is whether the screw is carbon steel or stainless steel. You might have a stainless out there. And there is different types of screws out there. There's hard facing and pit screws. There's ribbon screws, there's mixing screws, but for the most part, what I'm showing you here is a standard screw. Another thing we have to get is whether the screw is 2-hole drilled or 3-hole drilled. Typically drive-ins have a 3-hole drilled screw, or if you have high torque, maybe there's more than 3. But we definitely need to know whether it's 2-hole drilled or 3-hole drilled. Now, to get the overall length of the pipe or the screw, you can put your tape measure through the pipe and take it all the way to the end until it hooks, and then get your dimension, your overall length. So based on that information that I just gave you, let's figure out what screw size this is. Now you can use a caliper, any type of measuring device. Obviously, if you're up in the air and all you have is a tape measure, you can do that too. What we need to get is the OD of the pipe. In this case, we have a 3.5. Now everybody knows that a 3.5 inch pipe, 3.5 inch OD, is a 3-inch nominal pipe, right? I think you guys do. So this dimension can be a little tricky. If your flight's wore out, you're not going to get an accurate reading. So what you want to do is measure the outside of the pipe to the outside of the flight, which gives me 4.25. So 4.25 times 2 plus your 3.5 inches is 12 inches. We have a 12-inch diameter screw. Times 2 for the other side of the flight, right? To get the diameter. So when it comes to right hand or left hand screw, remember I was saying use the index finger? Well, you don't have to touch the flight, but if you go with the flight and it goes to your right, it's a right hand screw. So therefore, this guy's a right hand. For others that want to get into the screw and want to hug it and figure out whether it's right hand or left hand, yeah, I can hug it. But what's the most comfortable way of hugging it? It's going to be to the right, which fellas, I don't recommend. Might be in the conveyor, you might have a trough, might switch on. Always think safety. Don't hug the screw. Length of the screw. (11'9". It hooked on. Now measuring the thickness of the flight is fairly simple. 3/16 is very important piece of information that we're going to need is the pitch of the screw. So in order to get the pitch and an accurate reading, what you want to do is get your tape, run it with the pipe, go flight to flight, and get the pitch. 12 inches is what we have. Now this screw is a mild steel screw. So what we have here, guys, is a 12-inch diameter, 12-inch pitch, 11'9" right hand with a 3/16 thickness. Now let's not forget to take the bore size for the shaft. This takes a 2 7/16. Stitch welded, but in some cases it may be continuous welded. Now this sample that we're working with doesn't have any drilling at all. It's going to get drilled here pretty soon. It's going to be 2 hole on each end. Now let's start drilling for bolt holes. So in a nutshell, what we're going to need is diameter, flight thickness, pitch, length, shaft size, bolt hole drilled on each end, welding needs, and if it's mild steel or stainless steel. Okay guys, phase 2 is done. We're going to start phase 3, which is the assembly of a conveyor. What I'm going to do is I'm going to show you step by step how to assemble a conveyor from step 1 all the way through. So with that, let's get it going.
Where in the heck did that thing go? God, what time is it? Donna, how much time do we need for these presentations?
Okay guys, as I explained earlier with the troughs, this is a trough flange. Obviously it has bolt holes around this flange. Now, what you want to do is your troughs together and start putting your bolts to the flanges. But I'm just going to show you real quick what we do. Get one of these guys, pry bar. And what you want to do is put your trough together on the outside. So you get your trough, and then you're going to want to make sure you get your pry bar in there to get that other flange right in this area. And what you're trying to do is to make sure that the trough is flush to the top. Once that pry bar is adjusted to a bolt hole, what you can do is obviously move up and down, side to side to adjust your trough, your flanges, but you can start putting in your bolts and start attaching them. Make sure it's flush. Now I'm going to get the inside of the trough flush as well. And how do you do that? This is the inside look of this flange. See how flush they are? That's what that pin's for. Keep your adjustment up and down, then put your bolts, start tightening them. Now what you want to do is when you get to the bottom, you want to make sure this area is flush. You don't want to have a lip coming up, therefore your screws rubbing at these points. So you get your pry bars, and again, you just pry away, put your bolt in, and make sure that's flush. Now what I'm trying to show you at this point is how you can put the pry bar where those bolt holes are so that you can adjust up or down, so that way your trough is flush on the inside. Now once you get to your trough end plate, it's still the same process. Put your bolts in, adjust with your pry bar, make sure it's flush. A lot of times what our guys do out here when they're assembling, they actually clamp some metal plates to the top of this, both pieces or these two flanges, so that they know that they're flush. And then they start putting in their bolts. So now that you have your troughs together and then your trough end plate, the very next step is to start at the drive-in. Now why at the drive-in? This dimension. You want to have a clearance of 1.5 in this case, in this conveyor, from the trough end plate to the pipe. And why is that important? Let me show you. Because this end shaft is only long enough to penetrate this bearing and the seal. So therefore, if you start at this end shaft and you eat away at this dimension from the outside of this bearing to the outside of this shaft by, let's say, 1 inch, you're going to be off on your coupling bolts on your drive-in. So when you do put your drive on, you're going to have a hard time aligning those bolt holes. Yeah, I'm going to put a chain on it. I'm going to put a sprocket on there.
You could put any type of drive equipment. Heck, you might even slave it off of another piece of equipment. But I'm going to tell you what, 9 times out of 10 it's going to have a screw conveyor type drive on it. But I'm not doing a Dodge presentation, so talk to Steve about it. So as I explained, you put your first screw together, your second screw, and you get your coupling shaft and you bolt it in. You get your hanger bearing, you put it on the coupling shaft along with the 2 bottom bars, and then you start putting those together. Now, this little yellow thing is a shim. What you want to do is you want to shim it to make sure that this bearing is nicely wedged in between those 2 bottom bars. The next step what we do is we put a flat plate here and we make sure it's flush, and then we clamp it and start drilling for your bolts. There is no need to worry about having that 1/2 inch clearance since our hangers are made SEMA standards. You're going to get a 1/2 inch clearance around that screw. So this is our tail end, and it has a ball bearing and a waste pack seal. Put in your last screw, start putting on your seal, your bolts, and you're good to go. Now this is our discharge spout, fitted standard, but sometimes you want it in the middle of the trough or wherever on the trough. We typically send these out on the trough when it's assembled, or you can ask for it loose and you can mount it yourself. You have to pop a hole right here, bottom of the trough, and that hole has to have in this case it's a 20-inch conveyor, so a 21-inch opening. You mount your discharge spout to it, and then you just start welding it. Now when it comes to the inlets and mounting them to the covers, there's a SEMA standard location to mount them. You notice on this one, it's mounted towards the middle of the conveyor. Again, it doesn't have to be mounted in the SEMA standard location, but if you do want to get a SEMA standard location for that inlet and how to mount it onto the cover, at that point you're going to have to go to screwconveyor.com and download the instructions. Now of course it's a little bit more detailed when it comes to assembling the conveyor, a lot more wrenching, a lot more power tools, but those are just some helpful hints that's going to get you by. If you have any further questions, I'll be taking questions after this presentation, or come by and see me at the tabletop exhibit, and you can always go to screwconveyor.com and get more information. Okay guys, so what I'm going to be showing you is some replacement parts and how to identify those. This is a standard coupling shaft, 2-hole drilled on each end. Now there may be times where you may have screws that are 3-hole drilled on each end, so therefore you'll have a special coupling shaft that has 3 holes. This is a coupling shaft. This is a wood bearing, 226 style, pretty common in the grain and feed industry. We also have 226 style hanger frames, bottom bars, 226 style top bar. You're gonna have your hardware. Now in every box, there comes instructions on how to put this thing together. But you're also gonna have shims for the bottom bars like I was explaining earlier. With that, let's put a hanger together. What you're going to need to do is separate your hanger bottom bars, and now you have 2 pins on every hanger bearing. What you want to do is put the pin to the bottom and put your 2 bottoms together, clamp your bearing in place, get your 2 bolts, this point is when you check to see if your bearing is loose. If it's loose, that's where the shims come into play. Get yourself some wrenches. Now what you want to remember is not to over tighten your bearing, especially if you have a wood bearing, or else you're going to crack it. Final part, put on your top bar. Of course, this would be inside the screw conveyor itself. Goes into the coupling shaft, attaches to the screw. There's different types of bearings for each application. Depending on the type of material you're moving, you may need something more aggressive like a Gatke bearing, and something even much more abrasive, hard iron bearing, or something not too bad where you have a white nylon bearing. But for the most part, each bearing has its application, so if you have any problems with hanger bearings, it's probably the application you're dealing with. Now this subject always comes up. when you put screws together, there's special coupling bolts for that screw. Let me show you. See that thread length? It's there for a reason. The reason is you don't want to over torque these bolts. And by having this thread length, it's not going to let you do it. So a coupling bolt is meant to have a little bit of play inside that pipe. The last thing you want to do is break your pipe because of torque. So this is always safety number one when it comes to torque. This is what's going to shear off first. If you put a washer behind this guy and you over torque that, the second thing to go is going to be the pipe. So remember, these bolts are made to have play and you're not supposed to over tighten them. Now always follow your torque specs when it comes to these coupling bolts. If you don't have them, if you want information on them, come and see me. Okay guys, that concludes our presentation. I hope you guys liked it. I hope it was informative. I definitely hope I didn't bore you and put you to sleep. But for the most part, if you have more questions, I'm going to be taking questions in a little bit, or come and see me at my booth. Have a good one.